their highlights from the conference. So I would like to introduce you to those guests. We're really pleased to have Clarissa Brocklehurst join us, who's an adjunct professor at UNC's Water Institute, but also very active in several global level forums and programs, including the Joint Monitoring Program for Global Wash Progress. Welcome, Clarissa.
Thank you very much. Very nice to be here.
Great. We're also really pleased to be joined by Jan Willem Rosenboom, a Senior Wash Program Officer with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and with a wealth of experience in policy, strategy, and evaluating water and sanitation programs, including in Asia. Welcome, Jan.
Thanks, Regina. Good to be here.
Great. And a bit closer to home, we're really pleased to have Brooke Yamakoshi, a wash specialist with UNICEF, currently working in the East Asia and Pacific Regional Office based in Bangkok, Thailand. Welcome, Brooke. It's great to have you here with us.
Thanks, Regina. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Okay, so a quick reminder to our audience that the sessions of the conference have all been recorded. So do take note of any that you hear about today that particularly interest you. You can access those recordings from the conference website almost immediately after the sessions are finished. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Alex now. Perhaps, Alex, you can introduce yourself and get us started with the guests.
Sure. Thank you very much, Regina. So my name is Alexander Wingscha. I work for GIZ, which is the technical cooperation arm of the German cooperation for a regional program here in Southeast Asia called Fit for School. I am based out of Vientiane in Lao PDR, which is where I'm saying good morning from to all my Southeast Asian colleagues, and good afternoon and good evening to everybody else who's joining us from various parts all over the world. Yeah, welcome to the Late Early Show. For those of you who might not have been able to catch up on many sessions, we are planning to take a closer look, especially at the 3 plenaries, which included some discussions more on a meta level, overarching themes and directions. And we'll be reviewing and reflecting a little bit upon what was discussed there, thinking about the highlights, common themes maybe, or also some of the questions going forward that are interesting for us in the wash sector. But we will also have room for highlights of other sessions that our panelists, so also you as audience members, might have been part of. So I would also encourage you, if you have questions about anything you saw in any of the sessions, maybe also questions to people you know were on a panel or moderating a panel discussion, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will be reviewing the chat on the Passable platform and also ask our panelists to react. We might call you to actually pose your questions, so you're able to unmute yourself and open your camera, I think. And in that case, then be ready to open your mic and open your camera to ask. Having said that, let's dive right into it and start with Plenary 1 with the title, Getting Our Shit Together, starting us off into the conference week, which was a very interesting and lively panel. And I would like to ask Brooke, who I know has been watching closely and following the discussion, what are some of the key points, takeaways, highlights for you seeing this plenary discussion that really stuck with you and that you would like to also introduce to people here that maybe have not been able to see it live or watch the recording yet?
Great, thanks, Alex. Okay, so first let me say, it's great to see so many friendly faces and so many, colleagues and people from the sector in this region. And it's great to be a part of this Late Early Show. So a big thanks to you and Regina. For this first plenary, Getting Our Shit Together, I love the title. And I really loved what the panelists had to say and some of the highlights of the panel for me. So maybe I won't introduce all of the panelists. I don't know what you expect kind of for that, but I assume that everybody can look onto the UNC Water and Health Conference website and check out some of the details of this panel if they missed it. So as the title of the panel, Getting Our Shit Together, implies, it was first really about the challenge of both understanding and achieving safely managed sanitation for all. It was really a great discussion of what we know and what we don't know, and really what the challenges are and what's needed. And I have to say that I really loved the discussion because it picked up on a lot of the points that we had included in the State of the World Sanitation report last year that was launched by WHO and UNICEF for World Toilet Day. And here I do need to acknowledge Clarissa's leadership on that report as the lead author, as well as all of the wonderful insights and improvements by Jan Willem's comments back on that report, and the work of Kate Medlicott from WHO, who was a panelist on this first panel on Monday. So the big question posed to the panel was, what do safe disposal and management systems look like? And how can we ensure that they're resilient and sustainable against all of the different changes and threats that are coming with the future? So the first part of the discussion really centered around what is safely managed sanitation, and how both, I'll talk about first, some of the comments that stuck with me about how we define it, and then second of all, about what it is. So on how we define it, some of the aspects that were covered were about, first of all, protecting public health, second of all, protecting the environment. And then there was a great point that Barbara Evans made about being part of a sustainable urban system that includes not only fecal waste, but also stormwater, gray water, et cetera. And then as for this question about what it is, so what is safely managed sanitation? Well, first of all, it's a human right. Second of all, it's an essential public service and a public good that delivers huge benefits across society. And this is not only in health benefits, but also economic benefits and just benefits of social development. And finally, it's really this contribution to one of the core aspects that makes us human, and one of the core equalizers of humanity, which is about privacy, autonomy, dignity, and safety. So one implication that was also discussed around this of making the shift to safely managed sanitation in the SDG era, which we're now 6 years into, is really about strengthening the role of the duty bearer in the human rights framework. So the public sector, rather than just focusing on the role of households themselves, much of the same way that the sector has sometimes been approaching the question of toilets or just of containment. So I wanted to just maybe bring that home to the Asia Pacific region with a little bit of data from the most recent JMP report. So first, the good news of since 2000, the year 2000, the almost 1 billion people, so 944 million people in this region have gained access to safely managed sanitation services, but that still only represents 58% of the population in the region. Another 32% of households have basic sanitation and 10% less than basic. So this really just shows what the challenge is going to be to achieve the SDGs in this region. I will say with that, and there are regional estimates, but most countries in the region lack nationally representative at estimates. So while there's kind of enough population level data to make a regional estimate, at the national level, these coverage figures still vary greatly, and many countries still do not have estimates for safely managed sanitation. And no country is on track to meet the safely managed sanitation target in the region. Next, the panelists talked a little bit about transmission pathways and some of the new, more complex and more accurate aspects of the F diagram, as well as some additional transmission pathways and risks to be managed along the sanitation service chain, which I thought was really important. And picking up and connecting the first panel to the panel that we heard yesterday on Wednesday, for some of you it was earlier this morning, was a point about the need for critical thinking to be able to both understand and start to address these complex and diverse situations instead of just, applying kind of the same hammer and assuming that everything is the same nail. And then, finally, the panel concluded with some great points about why we're not making progress and where we should be investing to make progress. And the discussion landed and spent a lot of time discussing some of these challenges in the enabling environment, or in other words, the systems that deliver these sustained services. So it started with a discussion of who doesn't have access. And again, echoing some of the points that were made in yesterday's panel, frequently these inequalities, or I would say always these inequalities, are a function of power, of politics, and of these longstanding structural inequalities that go beyond our sector, but that we need to understand. And then as to these systems elements, it touched on political leadership and governance, on data and information, capacity building, both on technical issues as well as on these financial issues, issues of governance and social issues, investments in sanitation or financing. And then the fifth point was this great discussion about innovation, both what it means and what sort of innovations are needed, whether we have the right technologies and systems and everything that we need to make safely managed sanitation for all a reality today, or what sort of better technologies and approaches to service provision we need. What really struck me about this discussion is that these 5 factors that I mentioned, so governance, data and information, capacity building, financing, and innovation, align to the 5 accelerators that were included in last year's UN Water SDG 6 Global Acceleration Framework. And those were 5 factors that we also used to anchor or structure the State of the World Sanitation Report. And then maybe to just wrap up and pick up on one of the hopeful notes from that first panel before we see what others also thought about this panel, was a key message that I can't remember who made this point. It might have been Kate, but that was, making rapid progress on sanitation is achievable. It has been done in a generation by other countries. And again, to bring that home to the region, I wanted to highlight some of the going back even to the 1960s and 1970s, some of the countries that were able to make rapid progress, like Thailand, where I'm based, as well as Singapore, South Korea, Malaysia, and more recently, maybe rapid progress made by countries like Cambodia towards eliminating open defecation. And I'll stop there, I guess, and turn it back over to you, Alex.
Great, thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive recap of what was discussed. Fantastic. You touched upon a lot of really interesting points that were brought up. Before I hand over to Clarissa and Jan Willem for their impressions of the discussion, I wanted to follow up on one of the things mentioned in the discussion, and you also brought it up, is this question of capacity building. And one of the points raised is that, I guess it's sort of the intersection of data and capacity building. We don't know what we need in terms of workforce. What are the skills we need? How many people do we need? And I wanted to ask you if you maybe have some reflections on what we face when we look at the Asia Pacific region for that question. Do we have the data? Do we know what's our situation? And how can we maybe address this?
Great, thanks, Alex. That's a very complicated question. And I'm sure that there's a lot of people in the room also with some great ideas. So would love to hear about that in the chat. I will say, do we have the data that we need, the workforce data that we need? I don't think so. And do we have the capacity that we need? I don't think so. Some of the interesting points that were raised by the panel, both on Monday and yesterday, were about, what is kind of WASH as a sector? What sort of skills and expertise do all of us have? And I think it was Barbara Evans again yesterday that made the point that all of us come from slightly different sectors and are working together under this banner of WASH. And that's a real, strength. It can also make things a lot more complicated, but the sorts of skills that we need to solve complex problems are also complex and multidisciplinary. I would love to see, and I know that in many countries, and indeed, I was just talking to a colleague that's working on supporting this right now, greater capacity assessments, workforce assessments, projecting that out and looking at what sort of, skills, capacities, institutional capacity building, research, kind of local level research might be needed in order to respond to these challenges that are on the horizon for many countries in the region. And maybe just to mention some of those and connect, again, the yesterday panel to the Monday panel about what's needed for an uncertain future. I will note that these pressures like climate change, urbanization, migration, conflict, crisis, resource scarcity, and more frequent disasters. I'm sitting here and in Bangkok and woke up to this morning to flood advisories here in the city. The skills and the level of thinking that we're going to need to solve these problems is really going to be a step change, and we need to bring those sort of critical thinking, problem solving, and non-dogmatic thinking into certainly the next 10 years and beyond.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, already some through lines between the plenaries that we can see in the discussions. I wanted to ask Clarissa, are there any other points from plenary number 1 that were highlights for you that maybe Brooke hasn't mentioned, or any questions that you thought were particularly interesting by the people raised in that panel?
Well, I'm going to answer your question by deviating from what you just asked me. I'm going to answer the question that I wish you had asked me. How about that? I actually wanted to talk not so much about the plenary, because I think Brooke gave a really good comprehensive overview of the plenary, but immediately after I went to the sanitation policy session. And I thought it was interesting. That was very interesting because it's all about capacity. It was all about the African sanitation policy guidelines and how AMCA is rolling them out, which means that countries who are looking to build policy have something to rely on. The guidelines gives them a very good grounding for the kinds of questions to ask and the kinds of things to do. So that was really interesting to listen to. And it struck me when Brooke was talking about capacity, that I think, capacity definitely came up in that session, but we had a discussion about capacity of regulators. Sanitation regulation is absolutely essential. It's a big part of establishing policy, is getting regulation in place. I always say, there's no sector like sanitation for needing regulation. But of course, nobody knows how to do it, right? There are very few sanitation regulators who are trained, who have capacity. And the point was made that we can learn from water regulation. It's not the same, but we can learn from some of the principles of water regulation, and that now capacity building programs are being built up for sanitation regulators. So, don't lose hope. But I was also thinking that later on in the conference, I attended the session where they were talking about sanitation workers, and this is completely at the other end of the capacity spectrum. And the need to build better livelihoods for people who are at the moment manual pit emptiers. So you couldn't get a bigger kind of stretch of sort of territory in terms of capacity building between, I think, those two groups of people.
Yeah, thanks for bringing these up and connecting it also to the other sessions that you've been part of. And let me maybe also follow up with Jan Willem in terms of what you saw in that plenary, or maybe also other sessions that you've been participating in. What were some of the maybe common themes that were picked up that also stood out to you?
Sure. Looks like we were, at least Clarissa and I were in a bunch of the same sessions, and Brooke really summarized the plenary really well. Although I wanted to add a few things, a couple of things where that also come back all the time, and that everybody seemed to agree on, right? Like, we shouldn't forget how complex the sector is, and recognize that it doesn't do a whole bunch of things well, and that we need to get better at. Sanitation needs to be a public service. But then there were these points, and you touched on this question of like, well, do we have the innovation and the technology that we need? Where it wasn't at all clear that the panelists actually agreed. Well, actually, it was fairly clear that they didn't agree with each other. And there were a couple of these points that would be interested to hear questions about from the people in the room now. So we had one of the panelists who said, look, I live in an Indian city. It's really densely populated. It floods every year. There's no space for septic tanks and drain pits. There's no space for sewers. Where is the innovation? Where are the solutions that help me have sanitation there? And then we had another panelist who said, like, look, don't make the sanitation sector responsible for solving another sector's problem. If you are living in a city that is too densely built, that's a housing problem. That's a different ministry. Don't give that to the sanitation sector as a problem to solve, which gets again to that complexity. And actually, we can solve all the sanitation problems that we have with the technology we have today. And we didn't really have time to get into, well, what does that mean? There's the conclusion that maybe the solutions are, once again, they're contextual. You can't just say we have everything we need everywhere. But it was an interesting point to maybe dig into a little bit further. And something similar came up when we had one of the panelists who basically runs Brazil's biggest utility. And he said, look at the example we have at condominial sewerage. We have social support. We have tariffs that are we make money as a utility. We offer a sustainable service. Everybody can do this. And there was a bit of an outcry. It's like, well, everybody can do this. Yes, we tried, but the technologies that you use in Brazil, they don't work in other countries, and it's not that simple. And so there's another question that also came up in the rural water session that I'll talk about later. Is this question? Well, can we run this as a profitable business? With one of the panelists saying clearly, because we've been doing it for decades, and others not so clear because there's not actually that many examples, certainly not in the sanitation sector. So there was some interesting back and forth among the panel, and it'd be interesting to see whether there's other questions that relate to that. Maybe continue that discussion a little. Back to you, Alex.
Great, thank you. Yeah, maybe before I hand over and we look closer at the second plenary, because you just mentioned him, I think it was Klaus Nader who mentioned, I wrote it down as something he said, is the sanitation sector is a problem of management. The technology is there. Is that something that all of you agree with? I see some nodding already, or is there somebody who objects to that statement and thinks
I'm nodding because he said it, but I think Jan Willem's right. I think there are plenty of people who disagree with that. Is good management some sort of magic wand that you wave? Or, I mean, it's not to say that you don't need good management, but maybe you need technological innovation as well.
Maybe it's not an either or, but I do think, and that came up in the rural water supply discussion as well, that yes, good management is definitely something that that needs to be part of the model, right? And that's one of the things that the public sector stumbles over, the private sector stumbles over, gets back to the capacity building needs. But particularly when you look at rural service provision, you may be even more constrained than in certain urban settings. So I know that also because Klaus said that, and I think it's really, really important. Whether that's all that ails the sector, I wouldn't go that far. But he has a good point to talk from because they're doing really well.
It sounds like that maybe there was recognition, and maybe this is a question for you who were there, that although it's really important, obviously, to learn from what's happening in different places, that we can't just assume solutions from one place will work in another. And I mean, we all know that, but maybe we still aren't really behaving like we know that. And yeah, sure, there's a solution in this place. The infrastructure works and the management is working. Therefore, we still have a tendency to think that another context that's kind of similar, got some similar features, it should be the same. Was there much kind of that, the importance of local context, I guess, is the question that I guess that came up.
Right, it is. Yeah. And the other thing we should probably not forget is that Klaus also said, he says, look, it all starts with the household, right? You need water into the household, you need wastewater out of the household, you need collection treatment. And you require the household to have a shower, sinks, toilets, and unless you, so there's always that part where, we should not forget that part of the sanitation sector requires infrastructure. Everybody hammers on the fact that's not all it is, and that's very good, and that's very, very true. But do not forget that infrastructure is required, and that unless you get that in place, having all the management in the world or the different models around service provision, they would not be enough.
I think
sorry, go Clarissa.
Well, I was going to sort of jump ahead and mess up the whole flow of your planned agenda, because I think that this very much spills over into some things that got discussed on the third plenary today. And this idea that what we need is critical thinkers, that the big capacity we have to build is this problem solving, critical thinking, Barbara said, to solve problems that we don't even know are problems yet. And it seems to me that this is key to this idea of how do you can't just take a management model or a technology and try to implement it in another place without, you know, a whole bunch of modification and testing it out and trying things out and finding what works and then adjusting it. And those are the skills I think that we need. Not necessarily just sort of blanket management skills or technological skills. So I'm jumping ahead and giving away some of what I was going to say about the third plenary, but I do think that these things did sort of fit together quite neatly.
I mean, and I think that emphasizes that, you know, to solve the WASH problems, you know, it's a much bigger problem. That's then about education systems and how they work, and whether analytical skills and problem solving skills and critical thinking are taught in education systems. That's another huge challenge.
I think
well,
also,
and that's what the third panel said, right? Like there were quite a few professors on that panel who basically came to the conclusions like, yeah, that's what we're trying to do, but hey, it ain't easy.
it isn't easy because of having to break down silos. And I thought it was interesting because I felt that the third panel today, what I heard, and it'll be interesting to see if other people heard this too, is that there was this kind of existential stuff about how specialized do we want to be and how general do we want to be. And I think what the panelists were making a case for is it actually serves the WASH sector well if people are really highly specialized, right? They really know their stuff about something, epidemiology or you know, whatever, but they're able to work cross-sectorally. So they're able to break down silos. You know, one of the panelists talked about working with the social sector more, social scientists more. And then we don't all have to be WASH generalists because we'll open the doors to what other people know. And that sort of frees us up to be very specialized in something else.
Yeah, so the
and you recognize that in how this sector is organized, in that Joe Brown was talking a lot about the situation in the US, and he's like, look, it's hyper, how do you say that? Hyper separated into, you have your water, your wastewater, and then Barbara was the one to say later, it's like, look, there isn't a country in the world, or very few, that has a ministry of WASH. You know, it is very cross-sectoral, cross-functional, yeah.
And in the face of that, as Clarissa said, we need those professionals who can work across that spectrum but still have the depth, or the T-shaped professionals, as we call them, significant depth in one area, but a breadth across a range to at least be able to have the conversations, understand the problems, and contribute to the discussions.
I like that, a T-shaped professional. I've never heard that.
I want to be a T-shaped professional.
Yeah.
Me too.
Maybe just to add on to that, I will say, you know, it is kind of, maybe just to wrap up on that point that Jan Willem was making also about these kind of having a siloed sector. More and more in some of our internal briefing notes and documents, we're even being, you know, very specific about writing out the acronym of WASH. Because there are also some people even, you know, just coming back to us and saying, like, we need to make it very clear what WASH means. What is this, you know, particularly for people in some of these high income countries that are traditionally in a role of donors, you know, if they're not specialists, WASH doesn't mean anything to them because they're not, this is not something that is used in high income countries, or a sector that kind of sees itself that way in high income countries, which is something that was discussed quite a bit in the last plenary. Maybe on this capacity and workforce issue, I also wanted to bring up these topics around diversity, representation, participation, and power that came up in yesterday's plenary, because I think that they're really, really important, looking at who we have, you know, working in the sector, who we're listening to, who's taken seriously, who's considered an expert. And I think it draws maybe on, maybe something hopeful is that in a lot of these sector conferences, and including the Water and Health conference this year, we've seen much increased diversity of speakers, diversity of who's presenting in the verbal presentations and poster presentations, who's on these panels for the plenaries, but there's still a lot of work to go. Maybe just on one other hopeful note, I was really encouraged at FSM 6 this year to have the opening plenary be about some of these issues of workforce diversity, just at the most kind of basic level, representation of women and people who have usually been marginalized or lower power in the sector in some of these, being elevated in some of these platforms, which I think is another really important aspect of this.
Thank you, Brooke. I'm going to move us along a little bit. We've completely moved away from our program. That's okay, because the discussion is good and interwoven, and I think that makes it more interesting. But I do want to make sure that we at least touch on all of the plenaries, and if we hook in other sessions as we do that, that's great. So Jan, we might turn to you and just ask you for your perspectives on the plenary at the start of the second day, which explored the evolution of rural wash systems, and in particular, I guess the rise and importance of professionalised rural water service delivery. And that's a topic of keen interest in this region, obviously in many regions, but in this region, particularly in the Pacific Islands where I work, which is where around 80% of the population are living in rural areas and are managing their own water systems. So I'm interested to hear about the evolution of the rural water service delivery models and how professionalisation is playing a role in that, or whether it's seen as necessary, an inevitable necessary need. So perhaps you could give us your highlights and takeaways from that discussion.
I will do my best, and I have to really watch what I say, because the facilitator of the panel was Clarissa.
You know me well enough. You can be very frank.
Yes, but so please jump in when I miss important points or misrepresent the discussion, which was really interesting, particularly because the panelists really represented practitioners, right? We had somebody from Serbia, we had somebody from who was at the time in Rwanda, although he may not be based there. Kenya, with some great examples along the way, and the starting observation that Clarissa made, and that applies to me too. Clarissa and I are sort of from the same generation, and we grew up in the wash sector in development with this idea that if you worked on community water supplies, well, you installed the hand pump and you handed a screwdriver and some spares to the community and said, it's yours. And the community would be asked to manage it. And Clarissa's opening statement really was like, look, that old model of community management, that no longer works, because the world we live in today is not the same as the world that gave rise to those models. And that's really a theme that we keep hearing in this conference. And one of the leading things is, of course, we have committed to higher service levels under SDG 6. If you look at water supply, if you want to have safely managed water, it needs to be of good chemical microbiological quality. It needs to be available in the compound, preferably even in the house, and available when needed every time. So it needs to be reliable, which is very, very different from the village hand pump that is shared by everybody. So we have the higher service levels. We have much higher demand on sustainability, water quality. We have situations where actually poverty is reducing in countries, giving other opportunities financially, but also a much stronger focus on equity. We have urbanization, and that may in many ways not really play in rural areas, but we have a lot of these mixed cities that are kind of urban in nature because of what people do, but they're kind of rural in the way they are run administratively, because the administration hasn't quite caught up with the growth yet. We have climate change, so there's a lot of complexity to deal with, and that has driven a change towards professionalization And one of the things that also keeps coming up as a theme is that regulation is part of that. When Clarissa and I were working in rural areas, we never talked about regulators. There weren't any regulators. We probably didn't know what they were, what they did. Nowadays, they play a very important role, which is recognized. And so what we require to run a professional service is better operating models, capacity development, which we've mentioned already a little bit, and a very different way of thinking about financing that also kept coming back in the session, also from the people in the field. Really, you need to understand life cycle costing, not just talk about your water supply as only requiring the new construction, the capital investment, because if you want to set tariffs that give you a sustainable water service model, then that needs to be based on the life cycle running cost, not just the investment. And so we had a range of examples that were given by the panelists from Kenya, from Rwanda, from Serbia, focusing on different things. In Serbia, there's much more focus still on kind of state-run utilities. They're all publicly owned, and there is a huge role that the state plays in the capacity development and kind of setting the regulatory structures and the enabling environment in which these utilities operate. Kenya and Rwanda, that was very different. You have a growing role of the private sector. We'll get to that a little bit. A couple of highlights from the discussion is, of course, this recurring theme that many people are probably familiar with, is that professional management is often interpreted as only being able to be provided by the private sector. And I think a number of the panelists have looked at really an option, but ownership, whether it's private or public, doesn't matter as much as having clear institutional responsibility, being accountable for the services that you provide, and the professionalism with which the organization is run. And if that means we no longer have community management, that doesn't mean there is no role for the community, which I thought was a very important observation. And there are ways to aim for the best of both worlds, where you say, well, the community can hold the service provider accountable. And just from Burkina had a nice way of putting it, where he says, community members play two roles. On the one hand, they're taxpayers in the local community, and as such, they have a relationship with the local authorities, but they're also consumers, and from that perspective, have a relationship with the local service provider. And figuring out how to effectively play those roles can benefit from civil society support. So that's where local organizations, NGOs, even development sometimes comes in. Village committees may not be needed to do technical work anymore, but they can be supported to play a role in accountability of service provision. And there's two other points that I'll quickly mention, and then I'll hand over and see what others want to add. One is capacity, which keeps coming up as this is important. And the panelists from Serbia said, look, there's tools to help service providers of any size do a better job in running their water provision. One example of that was water safety planning. But at the same time, there are then challenges there for small providers in terms of being able to document and implement the sort of procedures that are much easier to do for big utilities, but actually really small for small rural water providers. And the Serbia example and highlighted the importance of publicly provided training programs, the involvement of other sectors, and transparency of investment decision making and things like that. And it's interesting to listen to that part of the panel discussion. And if the private sector is to be involved, they would expect to be able to recruit qualified staff and apply a profitable business model. And those are areas where the overall enabling environment, as it is created by the public sector, is important. And so in this way, private sector needs the public sector, and they influence each other. And the final point that came up is of course, who would have guessed, financing. And the big question is, well, if you go to rural water supply utilities, is it possible to make rural water supply commercially viable? And a couple of points that were made were the strong emphasis on the need to present life cycle costing, that I mentioned that already, and the question of what to do when there is no way to set a tariff that is acceptable to both the user from an affordability perspective and the producer of the water, the supplier, from the perspective of making a profit, or at least making enough money to keep the business running. And that was brought up, but we didn't really get into much of a discussion, but it gets into questions of public support and subsidies, which of course can also be lengthy discussions. And the old situation of small scale providers not being able to find the money to get started because they're not understood, or they're seen as too risky by commercial banks, that's a situation that's changing. And I found that very interesting. And there was a good example from Kenya, where there really is a growing competitive market, and where rural water supply is no longer seen as a high risk sector. And there was a very recent example of a water supplier who received a $5 million loan from a commercial bank. And that's actually not that common yet, but it's great to see that beginning to happen. So I'm going to stop there. I think Bruce on the panel summarized the needs really nicely when he said that the development community should support the utility management model at country level and focus on them being professionally run, accountable, and sustainable, independent of whether ownership is public or private. And I think the panel expressed a general session of optimism, seeing the SDGs as enabling, governments being ready to use the different management models. We have the pilots in the sector to prove that these different models can work, which means now we need to move in a systematic way to apply them at larger scale and scale up. But we also need to realize that we haven't really tackled the climate challenge in any of these service models and operations yet, and water is at risk. So that was sort of a cautionary note at the end. And with that, I'm going to stop and see whether there's others who want to contribute.
Thank you, Jan Willem. I'm going to allow Clarissa and Brooke to jump in momentarily. Clarissa, I can see you're ready. I wanted to ask a question, Jan. To me, it's quite interesting. It sounds like a lot of different examples of different models were discussed and shared. And I wonder whether there was the sense that for most rural situations that exist, there probably is already a model that could be adapted or modified to suit that context. And I ask this question because I'm particularly wondering, for example, in the Pacific Islands, where there are a lot of very small communities that are quite remote and at distance from utilities or private sector or government, if we are accepting that we need some level of professional management, I mean, even just the task of building their capacity. But I just wonder, was there a general feeling we've got the models for almost every situation, or is there recognition there might still be some situations where we don't quite know how to make this happen yet?
I bet there are situations like that, but the nice thing is that there's great examples and they're well documented. So the two panelists that had these real, kind of examples at their fingertips were both from Sub-Saharan Africa. When I think back outside this panel now, but to the years I spent in Cambodia, where small provincial private suppliers came up It's been a fascinating journey because it kind of bubbled up out of just entrepreneurial ideas with a little bit of French NGO support. And it took years, but slowly grew into sort of, formalized water suppliers that were accountable to a regulator and that had tariff controls and quality controls. But that's not how it started. That's how it's developing further now, and it was really, really hard. And I can imagine that each country has that kind of route somehow finding its way through the constraints to ways that work. And I guess what that requires at the country level is maybe what Bruce said, is the support from the sector, support from the development sector, maybe support from the government to help that happen and help that grow, and help understand where institutional capacities need to develop further, what sector capacities are needed, and how you fill gaps. Something like that. And I don't know enough about rural water supply globally to say, well, in every country we have something like that. But I'm very encouraged by the examples that we saw in the discussion and the things that came up there.
Thank you. Okay, Clarissa, would you like to jump in?
I would like to jump in because, I really enjoyed moderating this panel, and I thought the panelists had great things to say. And you're right, Jan Willem, they painted a sort of a whole picture of a different future in which service levels are a lot higher. And, there's just better service provision all around. But one thing I should say is that in the preparation for the panel, when I was talking to the panelists, they also tell stories of the challenges, and maybe they don't come out in the panel. And I don't think I'm sort of telling tales to say, I think Bruce himself talked to me about all the various ways that in Rwanda, the private sector operators think of innovative and imaginative ways to cheat on their contracts. I think that's the way it works. That's the way the system works. And again, it speaks to capacity building, is how do you come up with watertight contracts? How do you teach people to supervise those contracts? And then you make it so that you get that balance right. So your entrepreneurial private sector operator is trying to make the system work because he or she wants to maximize their revenues and their profits. But the local authority or whoever has given the contract is getting what they want, which is services. And I think we're not quite there yet because there isn't a lot of experience with some of these models, particularly the private sector models. The other thing I was going
to say, when you talk about contracts, one of the interesting things then is like, how do you use those to turn people on to the sector and see potential and want to be in it? Because some of the experience in Cambodia was with when the World Bank started to provide support. You get World Bank contracts with it that run to 80 pages and that need to be translated into Khmer, and nobody can read them or understand what they say or what they're signing.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes, can we do this in 5 pages and explain this in plain language?
And make all the incentives very clear and very transparent. The other thing is that, you mentioned that in Serbia, it's basically still a very state-run system. And, Dragana, who was speaking from the Department of Public Health there, she said part of the problem is that they find these very small systems that are basically a few households. They're providing very poor quality water. And so the government feels they have to step in from a regulatory point of view because they are putting people at risk by providing very poor quality water. And they ask the state utilities to step in and help run these systems. And the utilities don't want to. The state utilities have very little incentive to go and do this. It's fiddly and time consuming and what's in it for them kind of thing. So I think even, it doesn't matter whether it's state or whether it's private sector, getting those incentives right is really tricky. And the last thing I'll say is that, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that this panel discussion prompted a hugely sort of animated chat session, which I couldn't read because I was trying to moderate, but I could see it kind of flashing by. And I haven't even gone back and read it all yet. But I think some people in that were making very good points, which is, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Community management isn't perfect, but having the community involved in decision-making and in accountability is very important. But also that we've got to transition. It's not like we're going to be able to flip over to these new models overnight. And that there are many, many people, millions of people worldwide who are still using hand pumps managed by community methods. And how are we going to think about upgrading those? What is the process by which you take a point source like a hand pump managed by a community and upgrade it to a small pipe system run by a mini utility? And it doesn't happen overnight, and it's going to have to be done in such a way that we don't have any kind of, that we have to maintain services as much as we can while we're making those transitions. So
that also
maybe
links to one of the comments here in the chat. I just wanted to point it out. Edith mentioned from Kenya, like the transitioning from community managed to private sector, or bringing the private sector in, and how that is, sometimes fails or often fails, and how it's a complex system where ideally both sides are actually engaged from the very beginning to make these transitions or these collaborations work ultimately. I also, sorry, Brooke, for cutting you off. I'll let you jump on that discussion in a minute, but I just wanted to point out that we only have 5 more minutes. I think we can stretch over a little bit, but I also want to respect everybody's time, and we still have plenary 3 to touch upon. I know many things have already been raised, and we already talked a little bit about plenary 3, but I wanted to, maybe Clarissa, are there any points that in the discussion so far haven't come up that really stuck with you from this plenary 3, where we were thinking about the future of WASH, or really the question, is there a future for WASH? And maybe that's a question you also want to answer.
So yeah, and I think it's interesting that many of the things that came out in that third plenary today have been touched on already, because it was very cross-cutting, it was very existential, And the thing, I thought it ended very positively by saying that yes, there is a future for WASH, and basically, I think what one of the panelists, I think it was Barbara, was saying is there will always be a WASH sector because it's us, right? We may wander off and become part of other sectors. We may work temporarily for other sectors, which might be good. There's a lot of talk about the fact that many sanitation problems are actually housing problems. I think that's something that you raised earlier as well, Jan Willem. When you're thinking about WASH in schools, that's an education sector problem. So we have to be sort of mainstreamed as WASH specialists through all these different sectors. But there's a sort of place where we meet and are nice and sort of WASH and nerdy on our own.
Chapel Hill, right? Yeah.
The Chapel Hill maybe is where the WASH sector lives. And so there was, I thought it was very challenging to say to people in the sector, and I think especially people coming into the sector and sort of trying to plot their way through, just be open to all these other sectors. Don't be straitjacketed. Be ready for new challenges. There was talk of the next pandemic, which is always cheering to think about. But also my feeling was that there was this feeling that don't be afraid about being very specific. Though one of the panelists did say, in the bad old days, we were actually disease specific. You had disease specific WASH people. And of course, now we don't think of it that way. You have to think about the whole sort of breadth of the epidemiological problems that we're trying to solve. Because I think one of the things we're also seeing is that a little bit of WASH isn't enough. And I felt that many of the panelists, nobody said that explicitly, but I think that came across, that if you just tinker with a little bit of sanitation or a little bit of hand washing, yeah, you're not going to get the results. You've got to approach it as an overall extremely complex sector that reaches into many other bits of the development sort of landscape.
And I think Ollie tried in his opening, he had a really good opening summary. He tried to touch on this point. He says, look, we have more and more evidence that comes out that says this little tinkering with the kind of cheap, simple solutions that we've been using doesn't work from improving public health perspective. Doesn't mean that it doesn't do anything, but if you hold, public health as the gold standard. Like we're not getting there.
Yeah, and maybe just to say that I really thought that these were great plenaries, great discussions on that tied together so many of these really important things about what does it mean to then have to achieve safely managed services. What are the sort of shifts and different ways of approaching, thinking about working in the sector that are needed? There was a very, somebody made a comment, I think Clarissa, on your panel about, why do we talk about urban and rural as being so separate? Of course, there's different, things, but principles maybe of management maybe are the same. Looking at similarities between high income countries, middle income countries, low income countries, and both the challenges, aspirations, and potential, solutions or service provision models, I thought kept coming out, as well as accountability for service provision. Who's strengthening that accountability triangle, and whether we're talking about building capacity for the regulator or changing the role of the community, to be fulfilling some of those, or strengthening their role as a rights holder, or strengthening the role of the service provider, of the duty bearer, the government. I think these things were recurring through all the plenaries. And was a really nice kind of line through the conference. Maybe one of the things that you just talked about, Clarissa, you said, a little bit of water, a little bit of sanitation, a little bit of hygiene isn't enough. We haven't really talked about hygiene yet, and I know it's something that you're both interested in. I don't think we have time, so I wanted to give a shameless plug for today. We have Hand Hygiene for Asia webinars and events. You can find more about this. Maybe somebody can post these in the chat, but this is through this kind of Hand Hygiene for Asia partnership group that we have that includes WHO, UNICEF, Sanitation, Water for All, WaterAid, FANSA, and others. And so I do hope that we can continue some of that discussion.
Thank you, Brooke.
And maybe one thing, I know we're at the end, but one thing that didn't come up in any of the other plenaries, and that did come up today, is this fixation we have on low middle income countries, that kind of gives us the feeling, hey, we're done in high income countries. And Joe Brown from UNC was very clear. He said that nothing is farther from the truth, and he gave examples from Alabama in the US, where anybody who's not on a sewer, the only other solution that exists is the septic tank. And given the soil conditions in much of that area, they don't work. And he says, let's not forget about the racism, the inequality, all the issues that really play in service provision in the US, the lack of data. There was somebody in the chat who said, I find it easier to find data on the lowest income country and the other end of the world than I can find data in my own country, which is a high income country. So I thought that was a really important point to make. Sorry, go ahead.
Can I make a shameless plug, because Brooke made a shameless plug? So tomorrow's plenary is going to be on WASH in high income countries and why inequalities endure. And we're going to have somebody talking about Alabama, somebody from Alabama. Many of the things that Joe was referring to, Indigenous people in the US and in Canada, the Roma in Europe, Indigenous people in Australia. And I think that will be very interesting because I think we're looking for these sort of these parallels. I think we're also looking for accountability. I mean, I feel that high income countries get a sort of get out of jail free pass because in the JMP, they appear to have really high coverage. And we know that it's not true. We know that there are pockets of people who are unserved, quite substantial pockets. So I think I really like to see this conference also holding high income countries to account. And I think it's a really very specific thing that UNC is doing.
Thank you, Clarissa. And that resonates a lot here in Australia, which again, sounds like will come up in the comment tomorrow. We just don't have the data. So we tick the highest box for JMP, but I don't think anyone really believes that. So Clarissa and Brooke have both talked about some highlights they're looking forward to. Jan, last opportunity, anything you want to promote or mention as something you're particularly looking forward to in the last day of the conference?
I no plugs, no, but definitely go have a look at the program and attend or go back and listen to the ones that you're interested in. I think the opening session, day one, and the policy session that follows that, and then the pathogens in the environment session that followed that, they're all really worth it. So find a spare hour here or there and go have a look on your own timeline.
Thank you, and I don't think any of us really want to stop talking, but we do, as Alex said, out of respect for everybody's time, need to stop talking. But really, thank you very much, Brooke, Clarissa, Jan Willem. It's been super interesting to hear your perspectives and to add in some bits of perspectives to that. It is a really nice opportunity for us to be able to engage with what's happening far away from here. So thank you very much. Alex, thank you also for co-hosting. One thing Alex and I thought we might do right at the very end was just before signing off was we thought it might be useful to mention there are other knowledge sharing and learning events coming up in the next year or two that might be of interest to people here. Alex, maybe you want to mention yours. I'll mention, shameless plug also, Water and Wash Futures. We will have an online symposium around June next year, Water, Wash and Climate Resilience, and abstracts for that will be called for around March. And we will have an in-person conference, which we're all super excited to have in February 2023. We're giving ourselves plenty of time to overcome hurdles in the meantime. And the abstracts call for that will go out around June next year as well. So thank you very much again for your time, and I'll hand over to you, Alex.
Great, thank you very much. Also, yeah, thank you, Regina, but most of all, thank you to our three panelists, Brooke, Jan Willem, and Clarissa. Thanks for joining your experience perspectives with us. I want to, for like the Washington Schools crowd that is assembled here, I've seen some names and faces. There's going to be an international learning exchange on Washington Schools for Southeast Asia and South Asia, where you will be receiving some information and invitation soon from Brooke and myself. Probably there's also the Washington Schools Network website that I encourage everybody to visit and have a look at if you're interested in the topic. That's my shameless plug for the day. But with that, I want to thank everybody who stayed up late to be part of this discussion. I think that's Clarissa and Jan Willem mostly. Thank you everybody else for joining early or during lunch or after lunch. I think this was a fantastic discussion. I'm also very sad that it's only 60 minutes or 66 at this point. Let's do this again, I would say.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Alex, are you able to stop the recording?